The day we buried my father, the heat sat on Broussard like a hand pressing down. August in Louisiana doesn't ask permission. It just settles in and stays, the air so thick you could chew it, the sugar cane fields on either side of the highway shimmering green and gold in the haze. I remember thinking it was wrong for the sun to be that bright at a funeral. My father had loved mornings like this, mist rising off the bayou, the smell of damp earth and cut cane, his coffee cup permanently welded to his hand as he stood on the back porch looking out over land that had been in the Delacroix family for 4 generations. Land that, by the end of that afternoon, would no longer belong to me. I'd driven in from New Orleans that morning. 3 hours in my 10-year-old Honda, the air conditioning barely working, my black dress sticking to the back of my thighs. I'd bought the dress at a consignment shop 2 days earlier because I didn't own anything appropriate for my father's funeral. Not because I didn't care, but because I'd been too busy working to think about my wardrobe for the past 5 years. 2 jobs, then law school at night, then the bar exam. My father had understood that. He'd been the one who told me to go, to get out of Broussard and make something of myself, even if it meant I couldn't come home as often as either of us wanted. Your brain was always too big for this town, Nora Jean, he'd said, the last time I saw him, sitting in his study with the old mural of the bayou on the wall behind him. Don't you dare waste it here. Go make me proud. I walked into St. Anne's Catholic Church alone. I had no husband, no partner to hold my hand. My marriage had ended years earlier, quietly and without drama, and I'd been living in a studio apartment near the law school ever since. Walking into that church, I wished for a moment that I'd brought someone, anyone, just to have a hand on my elbow. Instead, I walked down the center aisle past rows of mourners who looked at me with a kind of curiosity I recognized but couldn't name yet. I'd find out later what they'd been told. That I'd barely visited while my father was sick. That I'd been too busy with my fancy law career to care for the man who raised me. None of it was true. The front pew on the left side was reserved for family. I walked toward it and saw that it was already full. My stepmother, Eugenie, sat in the center, draped in black silk and pearls, a lace veil covering her silver blonde hair. On her right sat my stepbrother, Caleb, his suit jacket straining across his shoulders. On her left were Caleb's wife, Marisol, holding their toddler, and 3 of Eugenie's sisters from Texas. There was no room for me. Eugenie looked up with dry eyes and that practiced sorrow she wore so well. She reached out a black-gloved hand, not to welcome me, but to pat the air. Nora, dear, she said, her voice carrying, the family pew is full. Would you mind sitting further back? We've had so many close friends who loved your father, and they need to be near us right now. I turned around and walked to the last row, next to an elderly woman who smelled of mothballs and peppermint. The priest talked about my father's generosity, his love for the community. He mentioned Eugenie 3 times. He did not mention me once. At the graveside, I stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the casket disappear into the ground. When it was over, Eugenie approached me, Caleb trailing behind. We're having a reception at the house. You're welcome to come. There's going to be a reading of the will afterward. Family only. She paused. I think it would be best if you were there. Of course I'll be there. I am family. She smiled, a thin pressing of lips that didn't reach her eyes. I drove to the house alone. The Delacroix mansion sat on 10 acres outside of town, white columns and floor-to-ceiling windows, built by my great-grandfather in 1912. Inside, caterers circulated with finger sandwiches and sweet tea. I found a corner near the fireplace and stood there, holding a glass I didn't want. No one approached me. A few people glanced my way, then quickly looked elsewhere. I heard fragments of conversation, praise for Eugenie, sympathy for Caleb, and then, clear as a bell, my name. Nora? Oh, poor thing. I heard she barely visited at the end. Eugenie said it broke Armand's heart. He kept asking for her, and she never came. The voices came from a cluster of garden club women near the buffet. I didn't confront them. What would I have said? They'd already chosen their story. At 5 o'clock, Eugenie gathered the family in the formal living room. A silver-haired lawyer named Lawrence Fournier introduced himself as the family attorney and opened his briefcase. The will was dated March 12 of that year. It left a small bequest to the church, a donation to the Historical Society, and the entirety of Delacroix Foods, Incorporated, including all land, buildings, and assets, to my stepmother. Caleb received $200,000 for his children's education. I received, in Fournier's words, my library of books and the contents of my personal study. The room went very quiet. I looked at Eugenie. She was watching me with an expression of perfect, practiced sympathy. "Oh, Nora," she said softly. "I know this must be a shock. But your father made his wishes very clear. My father and I discussed this. He told me the business would stay in the family. He told me I would have a role. People change their minds, dear. Especially at the end." She pressed a handkerchief to the corner of her eye, though I saw no tears. "He was so hurt that you weren't here." I stood up, my legs unsteady. "I'd like to see the original will." "Now." Fournier nodded slowly. "The original is in my office safe. But everything is in order." I looked at Caleb. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "It's what the will says, Nora." I turned and walked out of the room, out of the house, onto the porch where I'd played as a child, and stood there in the fading light with my hands shaking and something new and hard growing in my chest. My father had loved me. He'd told me I was the best thing he'd ever done. The man who said those things would not have cut me out of his will. And I was going to prove it. The morning after the funeral, I woke up in my studio apartment with a headache like a railroad spike behind my left eye. For a full 30 seconds, I didn't remember anything. Then memory hit me like a wave. $12 million, and I'd been left a room full of books. I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. I was a paralegal at a small firm in the Central Business District, a job that paid $38,000 a year and left me just enough time to study for the bar exam, which I'd taken 6 weeks earlier. My boss, a divorce attorney named Gloria Roussel, had sent a card and told me to take all the time I needed. I spent the morning pacing my tiny apartment and making phone calls. I left a message for Fournier requesting a copy of the will. Then I called my father's longtime accountant, a man named Thibodeau, who answered on the third ring with a voice old and cautious. "Miss Delacroix. I was sorry to hear about your father. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions. About his estate. About the will." A long pause. "I'm not sure I can help you. Your father's estate matters are handled by Mr. Fournier. I only did the tax work. But you would have seen his financial documents." I saw what I was given to see. There was a hesitation in his voice. "Miss Delacroix, I'll tell you what I told your father before he passed. Be careful with this. There are people who," he stopped. "I've said too much already." The line went dead. The bar exam results came a few weeks later. I passed, on my first try. I celebrated alone in my apartment with a bottle of cheap champagne and a phone call to my father's old number, just to hear his voicemail one more time. Gloria offered me a job as an associate attorney. I took it. I was 39 years old, starting over in a career I'd come to late, with no family money and no safety net. But I had a suspicion. And I was going to follow it wherever it led. I started digging. I requested my father's medical records, which showed he'd been of sound mind despite a series of small strokes. The date of the will, March 12, fell during a period when he'd been heavily medicated following a hospitalization. I talked to his housekeeper, a woman named Celeste who'd worked for the family since I was a teenager. She met me at a coffee shop in Lafayette, nervous and twisting a napkin in her hands. "Miss Nora, I'm not supposed to talk to you." "Mrs. Delacroix," she said. I know what she said. "But you knew my father for 20 years. Do you really believe he would have cut me out of his will?" Celeste looked at me with troubled eyes. "He talked about you all the time. Always saying, my Nora's going to be a lawyer. But in those last months, he was different. Quiet. Like something was weighing on him. She leaned closer. I saw things. Papers. Mrs. Delacroix and Mr. Caleb, they had meetings with Mr. Fournier. Lots of meetings. And after each one, your father would be in his study, just staring at that wall painting. The mural. The bayou scene on the back wall of his study. There is one thing, Celeste said. Your father, before he died, he gave me something. Said to keep it safe. Said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you and no one else. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope with my name in my father's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated 3 weeks before his death. Nora. If you're reading this, I'm gone. There are things happening in this house that I never wanted you to see. I've made mistakes, and I'm trying to fix them, but I'm running out of time. The mural. Behind the mural. What you need is there. I love you. Dad. I read the letter 3 times, my eyes blurring. Behind the mural. He'd left me something. He'd known, in those final weeks, that something was wrong, and he'd hidden evidence where only I would think to look. But getting into that house, Eugenie's house now, wouldn't be easy. Every call I'd made had gone unanswered. The one time I'd driven up and knocked, a security guard told me I was trespassing. I folded the letter carefully. I was going to get into that house. But first, I needed to get smarter. I needed to understand the law the way my enemies already did. The version of me who didn't make waves died the day of my father's funeral. The woman I was becoming had steel in her spine and a fire in her chest that wasn't going out anytime soon. Before I tell you about law school at 42 and the hidden room and the day I brought everything crashing down, I need to take you back. Because you can't understand the fire unless you know how long the kindling had been piling up. My mother's name was Camille. She was 27 when she died, and I was 7. The world I'd known, a world of warmth and the smell of jasmine on the porch in the evening, dissolved overnight into something cold and strange. My father disappeared into his grief like a man walking into deep water. He still went to work, still kissed me goodnight, but the light had gone out of him. I learned to tiptoe around his sadness, to be quiet and good and undemanding. Eugenie came into our lives 3 years later. She was a widow with a small son named Caleb, and within 6 months of meeting my father at a charity event, they were engaged. Within a year, she and Caleb had moved into the house on the bayou, and I had a stepmother and stepbrother I'd never asked for. At first, I tried to like her. She bought me new dresses and fixed my hair in elaborate braids and told me how lucky she was to have a daughter as well behaved as me. But the kindness had edges. You're so quiet, Nora. So easy to manage. By the time I was 12, the dynamic was set. Eugenie was the warm, capable mother to Caleb, her real child, and I was the stepdaughter she tolerated, the reminder of a first wife she could never compete with. She never said it outright, but it was in the way she talked about my mother, always with a slight edge. Your mother was very beautiful, of course. But she wasn't practical, was she? She didn't understand how to run a household like this one. My mother had been a painter. After she died, my father packed away most of her canvases, unable to look at them. Eugenie took them out of storage and hung them in the guest rooms, where I'd find them wandering the house alone, my mother's signature in the corner, Camille, the letters looped and elegant, a ghost in every brushstroke. You look so much like her, people would say. You have her eyes. Eugenie hated that. I could see it in the tightening of her jaw. She'd spent years trying to erase my mother's presence, and there I was, a living reminder. When I was 15, I overheard her talking to one of her sisters. She's a strange one, that girl. So quiet. You never know what she's thinking. I think there's something wrong with her, honestly. Something in the blood. Her mother was the same way, moody, withdrawn. I stood in that hallway with my heart pounding, waiting for someone to defend me. No one did. I learned a lesson that day. Silence wouldn't protect me. Being good wouldn't protect me. The story Eugenie was telling would be told whether I earned it or not. So I stopped trying to earn it. I focused on school. I made plans to leave Broussard the minute I turned 18. I kept my head down and let Eugenie think she'd won. That was my childhood. Long afternoons in my father's study, the only place in the house that still felt like mine. Dinners where I sat at the far end of the table while Eugenie and Caleb chattered. Nights in my bedroom with the door locked, dreaming about a future far away from this house and this town and this woman who'd decided I was broken. And now, 25 years later, that woman had stolen everything. The note from my father confirmed what I'd always known in my gut. He'd been under siege. He'd left me a trail to follow. But following that trail was going to take more than determination. It was going to take expertise. I was a freshly minted divorce lawyer, handling custody disputes and property settlements. I didn't know the first thing about estate litigation or financial fraud. And the people I was up against had been playing this game for years. I spent the next 3 years working at Gloria's firm by day and studying everything I could about will contests and trust law by night. I saved every spare dollar. I tracked Eugenie's movements from a distance, waiting for an opening that never quite came. The legal challenge I'd filed against the will was stuck in procedural limbo without new evidence. I visited Celeste occasionally, and she told me the house was unchanged. Eugenie spent most of her time in the front parlors and never went near my father's study, which she'd always disliked. That was a small relief. By the time I turned 42, I knew I'd hit a wall. I needed formal training, the kind that would let me go toe-to-toe with the best estate lawyers in the state. So I enrolled in a Master of Laws program, a Master of Laws degree specializing in estate planning and elder law, at Loyola University in New Orleans. It was a year-long program, night classes, and weekend seminars, designed for working lawyers. I could keep my job while I studied. I walked into a seminar room full of 20-somethings, all of them bright-eyed and fresh out of law school. I was older than the professor. But I sat in the front row, took notes until my hand cramped, and asked questions that made the professor raise his eyebrows. By the end of the first semester, I was top of the class. And I'd made a friend. Her name was Elaine Broussard, the professor teaching the advanced seminar on estate fraud. She was in her 60s, a tiny woman with steel gray hair and a mind like a steel trap. One evening after class, we sat in her office drinking whiskey out of coffee mugs. "You're studying like your life depends on it," she said. "You're hunting something." I hesitated, then told her everything. My father, Eugenie, the will, the note behind the mural. Elaine listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "In cases like this, the will itself is rarely the crime scene," she said. "The real crime scene is what happened in the months before the will was signed. Who had access? What was his mental state? And most importantly, where's the real will? The real will? People like your stepmother don't usually forge a document out of thin air. That's too risky. What they do is destroy the original and replace it with something that looks legitimate. Your job isn't just to prove the current will is fraudulent. It's to prove there was another will. A real one. And then find enough evidence to convince a judge that the real one is what your father actually intended." I thought about my father's note. Behind the mural. What you need is there. The hardest part, Elaine continued, is getting access. If she's smart, she's already locked down the house. You'll need a reason to get inside. A legal reason. I nodded. I'd been thinking about that for years. I finished the Master of Laws at 43 and opened a small practice on Magazine Street, specializing in elder law and estate planning. My clients were teachers and small business owners and retired factory workers, people who'd spent their lives building something and were terrified of losing it to nursing home costs or unscrupulous relatives. They reminded me of my father. Every case I won, every family I protected, felt like a small victory. It also built my reputation. And reputation, in the legal world, is everything. Elaine and I stayed close. We'd meet for lunch every few months, and she'd ask how the family situation was progressing. For a long time I had nothing to report. The will was still in effect. My legal challenge was still stalled. Eugenie and Caleb were still living in the house, running the business, playing their roles. "You're waiting for something," Elaine said one afternoon over poboys in the French Quarter. "You're not just sitting on your hands." "I'm waiting for them to make a mistake. People like Eugenie can't help themselves. Sooner or later, she'll do something that gives me an opening." The opening came in the fall of my 3rd year in practice. I was in my office reviewing a trust document when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "They're selling everything. Community meeting next month." I called the number back. A woman answered, "Marisol, Caleb's wife." "Marisol? It's Nora. I can't talk long. Caleb doesn't know I'm calling you." Her voice was low and hurried. "It's not right, what they did to you. What they're still doing. I've kept my mouth shut for years, but it's not getting better. He's turning into his mother. And now they're selling the business to some developer from Texas. Eugenie's going to announce it at a big meeting at the house, all the shareholders, the business partners, the community people. She wants to cash out and move to Florida." "When is this meeting?" 3 weeks from Saturday. "At the house. 2:00. "Thank you, Marisol." "I'm not doing this for you," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm doing it because I can't live with myself anymore. Just, please don't tell them it was me." I hung up and stood there, trembling slightly. 3 weeks. I had 3 weeks to figure out how to get into that house, get behind that mural, and find whatever my father had left me. And then I was going to walk into that meeting as someone they never expected. I needed to get into my father's study without Eugenie or Caleb knowing. I had one advantage: I knew that house better than they did. As a child, I'd explored every inch of the old mansion, mapping its hidden geography. One of those secrets was the old garden entrance. The study had originally opened onto a small walled garden through a set of French doors. When my great-grandfather remodeled in the 1940s, he'd walled over those doors and built the mural on the interior side. But the original door frame was still there, hidden behind plaster. And the garden itself, overgrown and forgotten, could be reached through a rusted gate at the back of the property that no one ever used. I drove to Broussard on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before the shareholders' meeting. Marisol had told me Eugenie and Caleb would be in Lafayette all day meeting with their lawyer about the sale. I parked half a mile from the house and walked the rest of the way through the cane fields. The back gate was exactly where I remembered it, half hidden by vines. I slipped through into the forgotten garden, a tangle of old rosebushes and live oaks and a stone bench swallowed by moss. The air was thick and still. The back wall of the study rose up ahead of me. I ran my hands over the old brick, feeling for the outline of the door frame. It was there, faint but unmistakable, a seam in the masonry. I pressed against it, and something shifted. I'd brought tools, a crowbar, a chisel, but I was terrified of the noise. I worked slowly, carefully, loosening the old plaster inch by inch. It took 2 hours. By the time I was done, my arms were aching and my hands were blistered, but I'd pried away enough to squeeze through. The old French doors behind the plaster were still intact, warped by decades of moisture. I pushed them open and stepped into my father's study. The room was dark and dusty and exactly as I remembered it. The mural, the bayou scene my father had commissioned when I was 10, covered the wall behind me, its colors faded but luminous. The leather armchair. The mahogany desk. The bookshelves lined with law volumes and my mother's old poetry books. I stood there breathing in the smell of old paper and wood polish, feeling my father's presence so strongly it was like a hand on my shoulder. I crossed to the mural and ran my hands over the painted surface. I pressed along the edges, looking for a seam, a hinge. For a long time I found nothing. And then, at the bottom right corner, I felt it. A small depression in the frame, almost invisible. I pressed it, and something clicked. A section of the mural swung outward, revealing a recessed compartment in the wall. My father had built a safe into the house itself. Inside was a metal box, locked with a simple combination padlock. I tried my mother's birthday first. The lock snapped open. Inside were papers. Dozens of them. My father's handwriting, letters, legal documents, and, my breath caught, a copy of a will. Not the will Fournier had read at the funeral. A different one. Dated 6 weeks earlier than the one Eugenie had produced. I scanned the pages, my heart pounding. My father had left me the business. The land. The house. Everything. And then I saw the other papers. Letters between Eugenie and Fournier, dated in the months before my father's death. Letters that discussed the need to protect the estate. References to the situation with the will. And one letter, in Eugenie's handwriting, that made my blood run cold. Lawrence. The new will has been signed. Armand doesn't suspect anything. We'll wait until after the funeral to present it. Make sure the old one is destroyed. I don't want any loose ends. I read it 3 times, my hands shaking. She'd orchestrated it. She'd gotten my father, heavily medicated, barely lucid, to sign a document that undid everything he'd actually wanted. I gathered all the papers and stuffed them into my bag. I had everything I needed. I slipped back through the French doors, through the forgotten garden, through the cane fields, and drove back to New Orleans with the metal box on the passenger seat. 3 days until the shareholders' meeting. 3 days until everything changed. Those 3 days were a blur of activity. I went straight to Elaine's house that evening and spread the documents across her dining room table. She read through everything with a growing expression of grim satisfaction. "This is enough," she said. "This is more than enough. She's going to prison, Nora. That's not my goal. I want the truth out. In front of everyone. Then we need to make sure you're standing in that room with legal standing they can't ignore." She pulled out a legal pad. "Here's what we're going to do. We'll set up a holding company, tonight. I know people who can rush the paperwork. That company will make a formal offer on Delacroix Foods, contingent on clear title. When Eugenie tries to present the sale to the developer, your company's offer triggers a legal cloud on the title. You walk in as the attorney for the mystery buyer. You'll have filed an emergency injunction by Friday. And then you present these documents." We worked through the night. By Thursday afternoon, the holding company was registered, the offer was drafted, and the injunction was filed with the parish court. I had a judge's signature on a temporary restraining order halting any sale of Delacroix assets until the will contest was resolved. Everything was in place. The Delacroix mansion looked beautiful on the afternoon of the meeting. The driveway had been freshly graveled. The azaleas were trimmed. A string quartet was setting up on the veranda. It looked like a celebration. And I supposed, to Eugenie, it was. She was selling my father's legacy to the highest bidder and cashing out, and she'd invited the whole community to watch her do it. I sat in my car for a long moment, watching the guests arrive. The business partners my father had worked with for decades. The shareholders from local families. The mayor, the head of the Chamber of Commerce, the priest from St. Anne's. They all looked content, as if this was just another social event. They didn't know what was coming. I checked my reflection. I was wearing a navy blue pantsuit, the most professional thing I owned, and my hair was pulled back in a severe bun. I looked like a lawyer. I'd tucked my father's old cufflinks into my pocket. The box of evidence was in my briefcase. I slipped into the house through the side door Marisol had left unlocked and made my way to the formal parlor. The room was filling up. Rows of folding chairs faced a small podium, and a projector screen hung on the far wall. I found a seat near the back, in the shadows, and waited. At 2:15, Eugenie swept into the room like a queen. She wore a white linen dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Caleb followed behind her, looking uncomfortable in a tight suit. Behind them came a tall, tanned man with the slick confidence of a developer who'd made a lot of money turning small-town legacies into strip malls. Eugenie stepped up to the podium and smiled. Thank you all so much for coming. As you know, this is a bittersweet day. Since my beloved husband Armand passed, I've worked hard to keep Delacroix Foods running. But the truth is, I'm not getting any younger. And neither is this business. She gestured toward the developer. I've decided to accept an offer from Bayou Vista Development Group. They've offered a fair price and committed to preserving the Delacroix name and the jobs this community depends on. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some of the shareholders were frowning. Now, I know this is a lot to take in, Eugenie continued, smooth as honey. But I want to assure you. Before the presentation begins, I said, rising from my chair, my voice carrying clearly across the room, I believe the shareholders have a right to know who actually owns this company. Every head turned. Eugenie's smile froze. Caleb went pale. I walked forward, briefcase in hand, through the crowd of people who'd spent years believing I was nothing but a cold, absent daughter. My name is Nora Delacroix. I'm Armand Delacroix's daughter. And I have some documents that I think everyone here needs to see. Eugenie's composure cracked, just a fraction. Nora, this is a private meeting. You have no right. I have every right. I set my briefcase on a nearby table and snapped it open. My father was the majority shareholder in this company. According to his true last will and testament, which I have right here, those shares passed to me upon his death. That's absurd. She's never accepted the will he signed. She's been struggling with her father's death. The will you presented at the funeral, I interrupted, pulling out a document, was dated March 12. It was allegedly signed by my father in the presence of your attorney, Lawrence Fournier. Is that correct? It's entirely correct. And you're aware that my father was hospitalized on March 12? That his medical records show he was heavily sedated following a stroke, and that his treating physician has signed an affidavit stating he was not of sound mind to execute legal documents on that date? The room went very quiet. The mayor leaned forward in his chair. Eugenie's voice tightened. I don't know anything about that. Your father was fine. Fournier has been disbarred, I said flatly. 6 months ago. For misconduct in an unrelated estate case. I pulled out another document. This is a letter, written in your handwriting, dated February 28, 12 days before the new will was signed. You discuss the need to protect the estate and make sure the old will is destroyed. You also mention that my father doesn't suspect anything. I held up the letter and began passing out copies to the shareholders in the front row. This is Eugenie Delacroix's handwriting, verified by a forensic document examiner. She conspired with Lawrence Fournier to replace my father's legitimate will with a fraudulent one. That's a lie. Eugenie's voice lost its smoothness. She forged that letter. She's been trying to destroy this family since the day I married her father. I pulled out the final document. This is my father's legitimate last will and testament, dated January 27th. It was witnessed by 2 people still alive and prepared to testify. It leaves the company, the land, and the house to me. Every shareholder here is listed in the appendix as having been notified of the succession plan. My father sent you all letters in February of last year. Do you remember receiving them? A woman in the second row, Mrs. Landry, whose family had held shares since my grandfather's day, stood up slowly. I got a letter, she said, her voice uncertain. From Armand. He said Nora would be taking over when he was gone. But then, after the funeral, Eugenie told us he'd changed his mind. She said. She trailed off, looking at Eugenie with dawning horror. She said I'd abandoned him, I finished quietly. She said I didn't care. And all of you believed her. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Caleb finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Mom, what did you do? Everything I did for you. Eugenie spun toward him, her composure shattering. Armand was going to give everything to her, everything, and leave us with nothing. After all the years I spent being married to a man who was still in love with a dead woman. She was almost shouting now, her face twisted with rage. She was never supposed to be part of this. I did what I had to do. Mom, stop. Please stop talking. But it was too late. I turned toward the developer, who was standing near the projector with his mouth slightly open. Mr. Bergeron, I should introduce myself properly. I'm not just Armand Delacroix's daughter. I'm also the legal representative of the entity that has placed a hold on this sale. As the legitimate majority shareholder, I've filed an emergency injunction to stop any transfer of the company's assets. Your purchase agreement with Mrs. Delacroix is void, because she didn't own what she was selling. Bergeron looked at Eugenie, then back at me. Then he closed his mouth, picked up his briefcase, and walked out of the room without a word. Eugenie stood perfectly still, her hands limp at her sides, her face a mask of shock and fury. I turned back to the shareholders. Now, I think we need to have a conversation about the future of this company. The real future. The one my father actually wanted. The shareholders' meeting turned into something closer to a trial. I answered questions for 2 hours, about the timeline, the medical records, the forensic analysis, the criminal complaint I'd already filed with the district attorney's office. Eugenie left about 10 minutes in, her white dress billowing behind her. Caleb followed, his face ashen. By the end of the afternoon, the shareholders had voted to suspend Eugenie as CEO and appoint an interim board. The board included me. After the meeting, I walked through the empty house one more time. The caterers were gone. The guests had drifted away, buzzing with the kind of gossip that would fuel Broussard's social circles for months. I went to my father's study and stood before the mural, the hidden compartment still open. I found it, Dad, I said aloud. And I'm going to finish this. The legal battles took another 18 months. Eugenie fought every motion, every subpoena, every piece of evidence. She hired new lawyers, then fired them when they told her the truth about her chances. She tried to settle, offering me money if I'd sign a non-disclosure agreement and let everything disappear. I refused. A quiet settlement was just a quieter version of the same lie, and I'd spent too many years carrying that lie to let it vanish into a sealed file. The criminal case was what broke her. Once the district attorney got involved, bank records were subpoenaed. Fournier, facing his own legal troubles, agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. He admitted to witnessing the fraudulent will, to knowing my father wasn't competent to sign, to conspiring with Eugenie to destroy the original. Eugenie pleaded guilty to fraud and forgery in the end. She avoided prison by agreeing to 5 years of probation, full restitution, and a permanent injunction against any involvement in the family business. She lost the house. She lost the company. She moved to a condo in Pensacola, estranged from most of her old friends. Caleb came to see me about 6 months after the meeting. He sat in my office on Magazine Street with his hands folded in his lap, looking older than I remembered, with deep circles under his eyes. I didn't know, he said. Not at first. Not about the will. When did you know? About a month before the funeral. I found papers in Mom's desk. I confronted her, and she said it was too late. She said if I told anyone, we'd lose everything. He looked down. I'm sorry, Nora. I should have been braver. I believed him. Caleb had never been strong, but he'd also never been cruel on his own. Cruelty was Eugenie's gift, Caleb had only ever been weak. Marisol left him anyway. She took their daughter and moved to Baton Rouge, and I heard she was doing well, working as a paralegal and raising a little girl who looked just like her. She'd been braver than any of us. As for me, I moved back into the house. Not right away, it took months to untangle the legal mess. But eventually, on a bright spring morning almost 2 years after the shareholders' meeting, I unlocked the front door with my own key and walked inside. Most of the old furniture was gone, too many memories. But my father's study, I'd left exactly as it was. The armchair, the desk, the books, the mural. I stood in that room and breathed in the smell of old paper and wood polish, and for the first time since I was 7 years old, I felt like I was home. I placed my father's cufflinks on the desk, next to a photograph of the two of us at my law school graduation. In the photo, he was thinner than I remembered, with deep lines around his eyes, but he was smiling a real smile. He'd driven 3 hours to watch me walk across a stage, and he'd clapped so loudly people turned to stare. I changed the company's structure, too. My father had always talked about making the employees shareholders, giving the people who'd spent their lives building the business a real stake in its future. By the end of my first year, 30% of the company was held in an employee stock ownership plan. The workers who'd been there for decades finally owned a piece of what they'd built. Elaine came to visit that fall. We sat on the back porch, watching the sunset over the cane fields, drinking whiskey out of coffee mugs. "You did it," she said. "You actually did it. We did it. I couldn't have done any of this without you. You did the hard part. You waited. You planned. You didn't let the anger eat you alive." She took a sip. "That's rarer than you think." We sat in silence for a while. Then Elaine asked, "Have you heard from Eugenie? Her lawyer sent a letter a few months ago, asking if I'd release her from some of the restitution payments." I said no. "Good. It's not about the money. It's about consequences. She spent 30 years lying about me and tried to steal my father's legacy. She doesn't get to walk away with a polite letter. Does she ever actually apologize?" I laughed. No. The letter was all about her struggles, her difficult circumstances. Not a single mention of what she did, or who she hurt. "That's the thing about people like her," Elaine said. "They're always the victim of their own story, even when they're the villain." It was true. In Eugenie's mind, she was the wronged party, the wife who'd never been loved enough, the mother who'd had to fight for her son. The facts didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the story she told herself. I couldn't change that. And I'd finally accepted that I didn't need to. My closure didn't depend on her understanding. My peace wasn't contingent on her remorse. The last piece came about 6 weeks after Elaine's visit. I was going through the final boxes of my father's papers, decades of correspondence and business records, when I found an envelope I hadn't seen before. It was addressed to me in my father's handwriting, unsealed and unstamped, tucked inside an old ledger. He must have written it in his final weeks and hidden it there, expecting that someday I would find it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "My dear Nora. If you're reading this, it means you found what I hid behind the mural. It means you fought back. It means you're standing in the house that should always have been yours. I'm sorry I couldn't fix this myself. I tried. But I was old and sick, and I'd made mistakes, trusting people I shouldn't have trusted, believing in a marriage that was never what I wanted it to be. I let Eugenie isolate me. By the time I understood what she was doing, it was almost too late. But I had one advantage. She never understood you. She thought your silence was weakness. She thought your patience was passivity. She never realized that you were the strongest person in this family, stronger than me, stronger than her, stronger than anyone who's ever walked through these halls. You have your mother's eyes and your mother's heart. Camille was the same way, quiet, steady, incapable of cruelty. I loved her more than I ever knew how to say. And I love you more than I ever knew how to show. I'm proud of you, Nora. I've always been proud of you. And wherever I am now, I'm still cheering for you. All my love. Dad. I read the letter twice, and then I sat in my father's armchair, the old leather one in the corner of the study, and let myself cry for the first time since the funeral. Not tears of grief, or at least not only grief. Tears of release. Tears of finally being seen. When I was done, I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the hidden compartment behind the mural, next to the copy of the real will and the evidence that had brought Eugenie down. A little archive of truth, tucked away where only I could find it. Then I walked out onto the back porch and looked at the cane fields stretching toward the bayou, gold and green in the autumn light, and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. Not the frantic peace of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Real peace. The peace that comes from knowing you fought the hardest battle of your life, and you won, and you don't have to fight anymore. My grandmother's words came back to me, the words my father had lived by, the words he'd passed down to me. Patience isn't waiting. It's knowing the right moment when it comes. I'd waited. I'd found the moment. And now the time that stretched ahead of me, the whole quiet rest of my life, was finally, entirely mine. If you've read this far, you've walked with me through the hardest years of my life. I'm not sharing this story for sympathy or to settle any remaining scores. I'm sharing it because I know there are other women out there, quiet women, patient women, women who've been told they're cold or strange or not built for the lives they want, who need to hear that they're not alone. The world will tell you that anger is the only response to injustice. That you have to shout to be heard. That quiet people finish last. I'm here to tell you that's not true. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is wait. Plan. Gather your evidence. And then, when the moment comes, stand up in a room full of people who've dismissed you and let the truth speak for itself. Eugenie called me cold. She called me greedy. She called me an outsider who never belonged. In the end, none of those words stuck. The truth has a way of dissolving lies, the way the Louisiana sun burns off the morning mist over the bayou. You just have to wait for the light. And if you're waiting right now, if you're sitting in your own version of that back pew, wondering if anyone will ever see who you really are, take it from me. The moment will come. Be ready for it. Don't scream. Don't rage. Just stand up. Open your briefcase. And let the documents speak. They're louder than you think.